Welcome to this session. We're having a fireside chat with Mark Hall, who is head of Google's VC and startup partnerships on the West Coast. I am Travis Cupp. I am one of the co-track captains for the corporate innovation track this week and a strategic design and foresight lead at TRUIST. Really thrilled to be here with Mark and excited for the conversation we're about to have. I'll just say right up front, anyone in the audience who has questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. We will have some time at the end to answer those questions. So keep them coming in, and hopefully we'll get to as many as we can. So just to start off with, Mark, I'll hand it over to you to introduce yourself.
Awesome. Thanks, Travis. Hey, everyone. My name is Mark Hall. As Travis alluded, I'm leading partnerships at Google for our VC and startups partners based on the West Coast. Been at Google about 7 years and really enjoying having opportunities to speak to audiences like this and engage in the startup community.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. So before we get into some of the more detailed questions, I think it would be great for the audience to understand a little bit about how, obviously Google's a very unique company, likes to do things a bit differently. Love to hear sort of the general approach to partnerships in the startup ecosystem that Google has decided to take.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say generally it kind of breaks down on a few different dimensions. So one is sort of education and enablement, right? Everything in terms of ensuring folks in the ecosystem are aware of not only what we have to offer, but sort of what's going on in the technology landscape, how we can help educate people on different offerings that are available. So that's one big bucket. Two, when we think of partnerships, oftentimes it's like a traditional sort of partnerships BD, lens where it's connecting folks, right? Like bringing parties together that have some mutual interest. So I would say that's firmly kind of the second piece. The third really is around like driving value, and oftentimes at the product level, right? When we think of opportunities for organizations and third-party companies to complement what we're doing in a given area. Oftentimes, as you imagine, partnerships could be integrations or complementary services that then sort of extend what we're trying to do in a given area. So those are the three general buckets that we typically think about partnerships. Depending on sort of where a given startup falls in, the way we engage could really vary across the board, right? Sometimes it's going to be a one-off where there's a specific tangible takeaway that you're looking for. Sometimes it's going to be much more long-lasting and sustainable. So it's really highly dependent on the industry, the vertical, the goals from both sides. But that's kind of high level how we think about partnerships.
That's really interesting. So it sounds pretty broad and diverse. How do you manage that sort of top of the funnel, right? Do you just have a ton of people coming to you? Are there instances where you go and seek out folks around a specific focus?
Yeah, first I'll caveat by saying Google's a really large company. So, the lens that I have is pretty specific in many ways to the startup and VC ecosystem. That said, most areas in Google, most product areas, they have a partnerships and a business development function. So oftentimes they have a more unique lens that's a little more, hyper-focused. Generally, I think when we talk about partnerships, the way we handle, that inbound, because it does tend to be pretty significant, right? Just by nature of, the space and folks interested in engaging with us. Oftentimes it's finding where there's mutual benefit and mutual overlap for, a given goal. Individually, I try looking at it where are areas that fill the gaps that our team's mission and goals really could be met through a specific party, a group of parties where we can come together. That could be as simple as an event, right, where we're trying to connect folks in the ecosystem to educate what's going on in the startup landscape. That could be more enablement, like I said earlier, around a specific topic. Maybe there's sort of recent announcements from Google that we want to make sure the community is aware of. And oftentimes leveraging third parties to help, with that, it's a viable way, right? So the inbound is definitely always there, and it continues, which I think is a positive indicator, more generally. So yeah, it really is a one-off. I think one of the best ways that we typically are able to manage things are through referrals. And when folks in our ecosystem, some of the venture firms we work with or startups that we have active relationships with, when they're able to refer us to other folks who are looking to engage, that typically helps in many ways. So yeah, to your point, there's a lot of ways that we could engage, that organizations want to connect with us. We manage it, as we can based on the specific needs of that engagement request.
Awesome. So you mentioned, one of the main things is making sure that there's an alignment with your mission and objectives.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you could give a little bit more context on that, and in particular, how does your strategy tie back to the broader business, to Alphabet?
Yeah, I'll give you the lens of my specific team, right? So I'm in this world where, we work closely with a lot of different venture capital firms, some internal, some external. And our goal is really to figure out how we can provide value both to Google and also from Google. And as I mentioned earlier, that comes in a lot of different, shapes and forms. Ultimately, the way that we kind of tie that back to the mission, right? Like, if you, not to sound all cheesy, but Google's mission statement still holds true, right? To organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. Like, that's something that we really sort of hold ourselves to. And one way in doing that is ensuring that if other organizations in the ecosystem are touching on a specific thing where, some partnership could help extend that mission, we want to at least be aware of that and explore the opportunity to do so. I think, in the future, we could talk through some examples on what that looks like. But ultimately, I think it's important to be aware of what's going on in the ecosystem, figure out how Google can add value. Sometimes it's hands-on, sometimes it's from a distance. But really, it's just contributing to the ecosystem, because we know as a broader space grows, it benefits everybody. So we want to make sure that we're doing our part to support, startups and well-established organizations and venture firms. But that's our team's specific mission, right? I think when you look at some of our sister teams, theirs are very similar in many ways. Like, we have the Google for Startups team that many folks who might be paying attention are familiar with. We have other teams that focus on business development and partnerships, not necessarily on the startups orientation, but more generally with big corporates and SMBs. So we have a number of different ways in which we look to engage. And at each step, it's a little different tactically, sort of, what we do, what we offer, what are some of those, programs that we put together, what are the program benefits, all that varies. But at the end of the day, I think we're all working toward kind of the same goal, which definitely ties back to the company's mission. Does that answer your question?
That answers my question. Yes, thank you. And I think it would probably be worthwhile just getting straight to that more tactical piece that you brought up, right? So what does this look like in practice?
Yeah, I think the short answer is it highly depends on what a given company or organization is doing, right? As you can imagine, we want to make sure any partnership is value add to everybody in that discussion. I'll give you one example without disclosing specifics where I think it conveys what a good partnership looks like. So in many ways, a lot of the different Google products out there have some ecosystem around it, meaning, there's an offering and then there are other, folks in the space who complement that offering or extend capabilities and things like that. I've seen really a lot of good partnerships form when organizations are able to, identify a unique value add to a given, area that Google's operating in, and essentially, extending functionality in a way that helps end users, helps folks who are trying to take advantage of a given service. And that's an opportunity for Google to elevate and lift, those organizations and highlight the great work that's going on in the community, while also ideally getting folks to be aware of our specific offering. So when you find that wedge where, maybe there's a unique value add that your company can provide, I think that's a great potential conversation to have on the partnerships front. So that's one key area. I think a more general area is, again, because the word partnerships is pretty broad, and I think intentionally we look at as a broad topic because it's helpful in that light, is figuring out like what are those intangible values that a given organization can bring to Google. And sometimes, that's through general community networking and things like that. So we partner with a number of different accelerators and venture firms to run different events and workshops and a number of different things that ideally, add value to all the folks who are trying to learn about a given topic, new technology, what Google's working on, or learn more about the partner specifically that we're working with.
Awesome. So it sounds like, the focus is heavily on the sort of connection between startups and the VCs, right? And obviously Google in that mix. What role, if any, do other corporations play in these partnerships?
It's a good question. Yeah, I think that's an evolving, discussion. I would say there aren't, clear things to share on that like right now. I think ultimately it's an important topic that I think we're all constantly thinking through, and it's definitely worth a conversation. But there aren't any clear examples to point to that I think would resonate with the audience. But I think it's very important, for all organizations to think through that. So hopefully next time we catch up, I'll have a more tangible answer there. But yeah, nothing to report right now.
Awesome. Sounds good. So I'd love to see about sort of advice. I think we've probably got people in the audience who are either they work with or for startups, maybe they're founders themselves. In your experience doing these partnerships, what advice would you offer to them around engaging with a company like Google and with other stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the very first thing to do is consider what's your unique value add. And I know that's such a trivial sort of phrase, but I think it's important to understand what are you bringing to the table that not only could be beneficial for a company you're trying to partner with, but other folks in the environment, right? Potentially end clients, end users, other partners, and everybody else. So first, clearly defining what that thing is. I think all too often when people think about partnerships, selfishly, they're looking at it one directional. And I think that's a problem. So having a clear value statement around how can we make this valuable for everybody? That's first and foremost. I think the second piece is finding the right stakeholders. And oftentimes it seems easy and obvious, but depending on who you're trying to engage with, you have to really be thoughtful. So if I just use, Google as an example, we're a pretty large organization, right? We have tons of different, divisions and teams and, tons of employees. Finding the right person who can help you, it's not always obvious and requires some digging and some research. So prior to just jumping in and assuming exactly who you should be connecting with, I think doing that research, asking around, probing, one, I think that just shows you can do good due diligence on that partnership effort. So I think it's really important. And then when you do establish that connection, ensure you're approaching it the right way. I wouldn't say quite approaching it like a investor pitch, but I think taking that same level of rigor and making sure whatever statement you're coming to the table with, there's a clear value there for both parties, how you plan to engage, what does your organization look like both today, but also in the future, and how that potentially impacts what that partnership could look like, how you can grow together. And then ultimately having multiple paths that you can identify. It'd be easy to walk into a potential partnership and say, I think we should do this one thing. Great, I think that's maybe a valid perspective, but what else? What if that doesn't work well for us? What are other ideas that you can bring to the table? And I think all too often, startups, especially earlier stage organizations, they don't quite, think through it in that fashion, which is okay in some cases. But I think to best position yourself for success is, really have that, message really nailed down, identify who are those right stakeholders that potentially, you should be connecting with, do the research, and then identifying what a game plan looks like. And then finally, I would say just remaining persistent with it, right? I think this holds true to any potential partnership. It would be easy to send over a cold email or a LinkedIn message, and I'm sure we all get a ton of them. But what typically stands out are the folks that have a compelling message. They're working hard. They have something of value to offer, and they're putting in the work. And I think all those things collectively typically will get you further than not. So that's the mind state that I sort of look at when I have my business development hat on. And I would suggest if you're a founder, if you're a C-level executive at a high growth startup that wants to get on the radar of any company, that's the approach you should take well beyond Google.
That's all fantastic advice. There's actually a question from the audience that I think relates to this really well. It says, being invested in by Google VC can look really good to other VCs. Can you talk about how diverse founders can catch your eye?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll caveat by saying I'm on the VC and startups partnerships team. So by no means am I in a capacity where I'm specifically, writing checks. I think to the general theme of the question, look, I mean, I'll tell you firsthand, I think, looking at a diverse set of companies, founders, and teams is critical, but has always been critical. I think, personally, I think now it's definitely, more discussed, but I think the idea and the implications have always been important. So how do you get on the radar? Some of the tactics that I just mentioned before are critical. I think leveraging your network in ways that could then extend, a reach into somebody who you're trying to get connected with, that's really important. At the end of the day, and it might not be a popular phrase, but at the end of the day, ensuring that what you're building is of value and it can grow and scale, that's going to be the best path, because ultimately, if you're doing great work, at some point it hopefully can hit the radar of folks, and then over time you can get in those rooms where you want, but not always the case, right? I think we all know the data shows that doesn't happen as often as it should. But leveraging your network, being extremely persistent, having a crisp message, and then looking broadly at who are all the potential partners in the ecosystem that could serve you, right? I think, fortunately in technology, there's not one, person that could help you grow, I would hope. And in that, it's finding, those folks who can help escalate you, whether it's mentors, advisors, potential employees, all those people in the ecosystem, like leaning on them to help get you one step closer to what those goals are. So hopefully that addresses some of what you were alluding to.
Awesome, thanks. I want to ask a little bit about what's changing, what the future looks like. Google as a whole tends to be a rather future-forward company, typically investing in really interesting things or trying to do them in-house. What have you seen through this, I'll use the word, unprecedented year that's changing in the VC and partnership landscape?
Yeah. Look, I think this year, as we all know, has changed everything for a lot of people. Ultimately, in the VC and startups landscape, personally, I've observed a lot of folks sort of look at a few themes far more regularly and with more depth than historically they have. So, themes like future of work, how do we operate and work in the future? Entertainment, education, right? I think anytime you have that layer of technology that could then, optimize or extend how we get stuff done, that's always of interest. But when you look at 2020, right, and processes change and your ability to work in the way that you used to, when all those things drastically change, then we have to figure out, like, what does that future look like? So I think those themes are one of the big areas where I think people haven't necessarily pivoted toward, but have put more attention. That's one. Two, I think understanding how the way we engage with different, folks at a personal, professional level, those are themes that we should all be aware of on a regular basis, just because as we build networks professionally in the VC and startup space, networking is a key activity and a key, effort that we all need to put in. Being thoughtful about like a new way to approach that's definitely been top of mind for me. And Google more broadly, I think, looks at all of those things and figures out, like, how can we, help add value in ways that really make sense, or stick with our initial missions across each of our products. So it really varies. I think in the venture world, every firm has their unique approach, and most of what they're doing is visible publicly around, where they're investing or what are the themes and content they're putting out. What I would suggest, if you're a founder or startup in the audience and you want to know what some of those things are, like pay attention to what the firms are saying. Like do the research and identify what are the topics that are coming up more often in 2020 post lockdown quarantine environment, and how does that change in the coming months, right? With recent news, folks are anticipating some potential change. What does that mean for a shift in direction or a shift in narrative? And as you pay attention to that, typically it should give you a little insight as to what's around the corner, at least for a given firm or individual, if not more broadly for that environment. So I know that's sort of a little all over the place, but it's kind of my 2 cents from my view. I have a few perspectives, and I think we're seeing some of that shape out with a lot of the partners that we work with, which is a pretty broad set of organizations.
Great. Yeah, I think all of this is fantastic advice and really helpful perspective. I see that we're 22 minutes in, so I want to make sure that we keep pulling in questions from the audience. If you're watching and or listening, again, please feel free to put those in the chat. Got another one here that's a pretty direct question around what are some of the benefits of being a Google portfolio company?
That's an interesting question. I think broadly it's having a connection and inroad to Google. I think that could be an advantage, but typically the way I look at it is if I'm as an individual, helping support any company, whether it's Google backed or not, it's thinking through what are the unique ways that we can, help give insights and provide some interesting perspectives. It's tough because so much of it's really specific to given industries and verticals. So without like a more tangible example, would be a little difficult. But what I think more broadly is how can we ensure that whatever that company needs, both for internal and external partners, how do we bring that to the table? And sometimes it's not always clear up front, right? It requires an ongoing conversation. Sometimes those things evolve. What we think is valuable on day one isn't valuable in the future. So that it's an ongoing conversation. And part of it is really dependent on sort of what part of, that Google ecosystem you're referring to. It's not just one sort of team managing that. So it really varies.
Awesome. I'm taking from those last comments that you've probably seen a few companies pivot. Is that true?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit more, or maybe if there is an example you can share, great. If not, that's fine too. But what helps, or what have you seen be effective when a startup reaches that point where they realize that initial thing that they thought was going to be valuable isn't as valuable as they thought it was going to be, and they find themselves in that moment of saying, okay, we need to pivot?
Yeah. And it definitely becomes I think an awakening moment for a company when they're rethinking, their go-to-market, their product roadmap, their strategy, and a lot of considerations need to come into play, right? And every founder should kind of take an introspective look and understand what are those unique strengths that their team or their product has that would then allow them to figure out what the future can hold. I think, from my individual perspective, when I've seen those moments occur, it's being super mindful of like, what was a core mission of what you started with? How do you stay true to that in new ways, right? So it might not be an entirely massive pivot. It might be adjusting, the way your product enters a market or the way your product serves a customer, but ultimately what you set out to do is still true. So that's one area. And then I think, publicly, we've all seen, broad examples of companies just doing about face in ways that, seems like a stark contrast. And sometimes that works as well. It really depends on, in the given company, how are you structured to adjust, and what are the folks around you, your advisors, your investors, your employees, what are they saying, and how you identify that mission that you feel like you can actually stick to. The market at the end of the day dictates what's effective and what's not. Customers and their feedback is those early indicators that typically you can use to figure out, are you pivoting toward a direction that might make more sense? How can you identify who are other folks you should be reaching out to that maybe historically you haven't had an open channel to? All those are things you need to think through. And, from a partnership lens, as you explore other ways that folks can help you get to that new point, being mindful and open-minded on all the possibilities, that's key. Sometimes we get too bogged down with, the specific approach, and we're not, as creative maybe as we need to. Magic sometimes happens out of those crazy moments. So being open-minded and receptive to what your customers are saying, what your unique strengths are that maybe weren't as visible or clear early on, but now through feedback and feedback from the team, like that can surface. So those are some of the things I think through. But look, at the end of the day, Travis, you and I both know every startup story is a little different and they have to pave their own journey. My advice often to any founder I work with is, ignore the 99% of opinions and feedback you get from folks who either aren't in your shoes, aren't actively working on your product, aren't in your market, or aren't actively doing what you're doing, or aren't paying for your service, right? Like, you listen to those people with a amplified ear and ignore kind of the distractions in the market. That hopefully is going to point you in a better direction.
Absolutely. And to what extent, again, if any, does Google help their partners, their startup partners, with that transition? Is there any kind of sort of mentoring that Google provides when they enter into a partnership with a startup?
Yeah, it depends on what that initial engagement point with Google is, right? So as I mentioned earlier, we have a number of different organizations. Like, if I take Google for Startups as one awesome example, that team does phenomenal work with startups, across different, industries and verticals. There's been multiple cohorts that have pivoted in many ways that in terms of like their mission and their product set, but ultimately, it's having the resources, the mentors and the advisors to help keep you on track and support you in those things moving forward. Sometimes that's purely, like you mentioned, at an advisory level. Sometimes it's, educational in terms of how Google products can help support that. Sometimes it's just more technology based on like, what are all the things in the marketplace that could help you make that pivot in the way that you feel like is appropriate, and then giving you the resources to get there. So that's one bucket. More broadly, I think there are teams and experts at Google who just have experience that really we've seen a number of things that maybe that specific founder or executive has not, and just advice and guidance in that light would be helpful. So it does range across the board, and yeah, apologies, I can't come up with specific examples. I think there are a number of things that folks probably have seen even, in the audience on their own. But ultimately, Google tries to serve the startups we work with in any way, and it looks different for each one, especially when you think of the different stages that some companies are at, right? If it's much earlier, then oftentimes there's much less shifting that's needed because they haven't, put too much out there. And in other cases where they've been at it for quite some time, it's a little more stark.
So it sounds like there are a ton of different ways for startups to engage with Google, which is fantastic. Before I get to the next question in the Q&A, I just want to ask this critical question, on behalf of the audience. For startups that are interested in partnering with and through Google, how should they get in touch? How should they engage?
Yeah. I would say a few things. Like if you're referring to sort of the team level, identify what is that organization in Google that I think really can, excel what I'm looking for. If it's somebody like Google for Startups, find them on maybe social media as a starting point, right? They're pretty public out there, or, finding an individual stakeholder on LinkedIn. That would be one approach. I think more common is the traditional channels, on our website, right? On a given form where it's an interest or request, like starting there is most often helpful. And I think that at least will allow the team to triage and get you pointed in the right direction. it's always important to have fair expectations. There's a lot of folks who are always expressing interest, and I think patience is important, relevance is important. If you're assuming that you're the only startup in the world that should be talking to Google, I think you'd be hard pressed to get the response you're looking for. But I think fortunately we've built out a community and an ecosystem, and we've invested in ensuring we can best serve the startups and VCs that we work with. So that's the more common avenue. And then separately, if you're a early stage founder and you're just being really scrappy, I think exploring all avenues, right? Like in this age in 2020, it's not always difficult or impossible to get a hold of the people you're trying to reach. It's just a matter of being persistent and getting creative with that. So I would advise you start with the traditional channels. If that's not working for you, maybe you move to connecting with people via social. And then if that's not working, get a little more creative.
Wonderful. All right, I'm gonna shift to Q&A as kind of the main driver for the remainder of the conversation. We have a question from Suzanne Duke. It says, assuming you have a clear value proposition and game plans to support the partnership, what is your advice for startups or / small business to navigate large, highly matrixed enterprises to keep the conversation going?
Yeah, that's a great question, Suzanne. Yeah, I think it's incumbent on you to have a game plan that enables you to manage that relationship. I think first, you're already in a good position because you've recognized that it's not easy and it requires work. That's I think one misnomer that a lot of folks accidentally step into. They assume that Google's one person, and if they're working with that one person, they're all set, right? In some cases that might be true, but oftentimes it's not. And if you have to navigate multiple stakeholders, multiple teams and departments, having a game plan there and having accountability that's attributed and mapped out, that's one key area. Two, I think when you think through what that relationship looks like over the long run, it's important to continue to grow, that footprint that your organization is trying to have in a large corporate. And ultimately, if that value proposition is pretty crystal clear and it's strong and both sides acknowledge that, it's really important to constantly remind folks of what they signed up for when they first engage. Things change, and over time, as the landscape changes, certain priorities might be moved down the list, other things might move up. As you have that roadmap and that game plan, being nimble enough to reprioritize your side in a way that maybe complements what's going on in the broader landscape. That's one approach. But generally building strong relationships across a broad set of stakeholders, and then making sure that you're holding folks accountable to whatever they signed up for. If you're getting resistance there, I think it's important to put your salesperson hat on and figure out how do you reestablish those inroads, those easy wins, not just across one area, but across multiple areas, and then driving momentum there. So it's not unlike any large enterprise, sales effort that you might be familiar with, Suzanne, but it's important to think through, that organization that you're trying to get closer with. How are they operating independent of you? What are the things you need to be mindful of that maybe you don't have visibility into that would change or shift or require you to adjust the way that you're engaging with them? And the more you're thoughtful about that, the more you're pushing and asking questions, you'll probably get some of the responses and clarity that you need to make sure you're one step closer to that tactical goal you're trying to accomplish. And after you have a few of those, then you typically get a lot of momentum, and then those future things are a little easier.
Thanks for that, Mark. Suzanne, feel free to follow up on that in the chat if you so desire. So just kind of an out of the blue question. I'm curious. Oh, well, we do have another. I'll go straight to the audience question. All right. Thank you, Birat. I was about to ask my own question. On a broad level, can you describe what your enterprise sales experience has been like? What's the hardest part about enterprise sales? How do you sell if you're trying to find product market fit?
Yeah, That's a really interesting question. I assume, they've recognized that, prior to this current role, I spent some time doing that. Yeah, there's a number of different, strategies and tactics that I use. I think ultimately what the experience has been like, it's been super informative on understanding how people as individuals operate within the context of a company. And at the end of the day, I boil it down to incentives, like purely, right? Everybody as an individual has their core set of incentives, and that aligns in some way, either directly or indirectly, with the goals and incentives of the organization. So anytime you have any enterprise sales engagement, you have to have a really long-term view, because normally it means we're talking some larger, either sticker price or some larger, engagement, partnership, commitment, whatever that is. And it takes a lot to get that done. Having that game plan that kind of we talked through before, some, mutual joint effort, that's key. As you build those relationships, you start identifying folks have different levers that they pull and they lean on to get stuff done, and being, sympathetic to that, but also being able to support that. The relationships you have are going to be everything in trying to get closer to that sales goal is one example. And as you do that, it's being mindful on like, what are the things you need to bring to the table that might be above and beyond what you initially promised or expected. And the same might be true to the client that you're trying to work with. As you start mapping out all those things, typically you have a core set of stakeholders that you've both agreed that are going to help you on that effort. You have some game plan that says how you're going to get there. You have some clear value add either from your product or service that both sides agree is worth it. Then it's a matter of going through, in some cases, the technical investigation. Like, what do we need to get the technical win to show that this is a viable, purchase, integration, whatever it is. And once you do that, it's working through some of the more complex stuff, right? The legal, all the back end office, the contractual stuff. All that takes a long time. Be mindful up front, setting fair expectations that you're in that for the long journey. Hopefully you have the right team to help execute that. Typically, that's the lens that I would take. This is a model that's been working for a really long time. So there are tons of valuable resources out there. If you're in an enterprise sales motion and you're trying to learn more about how to optimize that, invest the time, because you'll find best practices that can really save you days, weeks, and months worth of effort in trying to accomplish those small things you want to accomplish. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Mark. I think one of my favorite themes from this conversation so far is really around the importance of establishing relationships, really investing in finding the right people to talk to, and also using that as a way of refining the value proposition, right? That it's not just the idea on its own that's going to sell itself, but that there's a lot of research and a lot of work that has to go into navigating, especially if you want to partner with a large institution, all of the different people that are in that institution with different roles, with different incentives, and really just navigating those relationships well in order to get that partnership to stick and to take off.
Yeah, I think it's a great observation, Travis, and so much of it relies on relationships. I think that's a key part, but ultimately, to your point, making sure that what you're trying to engage on, whatever that substance is, that product, that service, that idea, making sure like you're actually talking to the right people. I know, in previous lives when I've been a builder, my first inclination is anything I build, people must love because I built it and my ideas, are always the best. When we all know that's the farthest thing from the truth. And finding that alignment with, organizations, people, departments that see that opportunity, not just where it is today, but where it could be. I think those are the most important things. And as you build a relationship, it's important to nurture it in ways that are going to take you, from where you are now to the future. So I think what you said is spot on.
And I hope that people take away also, your comments around the importance of openness and humility and tenacity in that process.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I don't see another question yet. I am curious, though, since we've just talked about enterprise sales on a personal level, that transition of going from enterprise sales to the role that you're in now. Do you find that there are a lot of similarities? What are the things that are different?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think, partnerships and business development work is really similar to sales, right? A lot of the core skill sets that we already talked about, relationship building, finding alignment, being able to map out a game plan that's going to drive success for multiple stakeholders. All those things are pretty consistent, right? I think some of the core distinctions are, sometimes, in sales, you're time bound, whether it's, monthly, quarterly, annually, right? Based on certain targets. Whereas I think in many cases, fortunately, with partnerships, you can take a longer term view, which I understand to be really, really helpful, right? If we're trying to build something that's lasting, that's impactful, that's big, among two parties, we can't expect to build it overnight. And having that mindset and making that shift, that's been important. I think sales as a skill set is critical for arguably everybody, right? In some way, shape, or form. I think being able to take rejection, that's a core skill set that if you're a startup founder, executive, that will always serve you well, right? And then being able to understand people, motivations, incentives, all those things tie into partnerships, sales, building companies. Because, when you build a company, it's not in isolation, it's not in a vacuum. And outside of your team, you're often really dependent on a number of different people or organizations. So being mindful of all those things, I think that's important.
Cool. We got a couple more questions that came in. One really around this concept of building relationships. Says that sometimes there's this conflict between, I think, sort of that longer term concept of building the relationship over time versus getting straight to the point. Can you describe maybe a little bit what the term relationship means to you? What all does that capture?
Yeah, that's a good point. I would say what you just described, those aren't mutually exclusive, right? You can get to the point while still build relationships, meaning if we're engaging for the first time, I think being really clear, concise, and deliberate about the what and the why of what we're trying to accomplish, that's key, right? I think capturing attention and getting people bought into that reason, the vision, both today and in the future, that's important. When we talk about building relationships from a partnership standpoint, it's actually everything in the middle, going from what we talked about today to incrementally making progress, demonstrating that I'm committing to that progress, you're committing to that progress, you're willing to do those things behind the scenes, not just when we're connecting, but day to day, week to week, you're making that incremental effort and improvement on whatever we agreed on. It's those things. It's being empathetic to all the challenges you have behind the scenes and the challenges I have behind the scenes, not letting it necessarily distract from what we're trying to accomplish, but knowing that it could have an impact. And then just sticking to the goal, right? I hate to sound, cheesy, but if you look at relationships at a very basic fundamental level, it's that agreement, right? And the same is true in a professional and business context, right? It's agreeing to accomplish some goal and taking the steps necessary. So when we talk about getting straight to the point, I think you can do those things and you're constantly trying to address what do we need to get done today? Or what is our goal and OKR for the next 30, 60, 90 days? What have you and I done to collectively get us closer there? Those are things I think are ongoing conversations you should constantly have. It doesn't necessarily change the way you engage. And again, some of what I'm talking about is highly specific to my work style, but I think it oftentimes works well to help you build a long-term relationship.
Fantastic. And I love that point around empathy, right? And understanding that, on both sides of a partnership, people have the rest of their lives going on, right? And other competing priorities. So really fantastic. Couple more questions and we'll wrap up. Just a quick one here. What sort of protections does Google provide in any kind of partnership agreement in terms of NDAs? How does Google treat IP and that sort of thing?
Yeah, for any questions on those topics, I would defer you to whoever you're connecting with, what that relationship and engagement point is. Typically, there are stakeholders from teams across some of the areas you mentioned, like legal and others, that can give you that insight and guidance. So, like, I don't have any broad view on that or any specific statement or opinion. I'd say like defer to the people you're working with and ask those questions, and they can point you in the right direction.
Perfect. And last question, Mark, how can we connect with you? Are you on Instagram, LinkedIn, any other social media? I would say Google Plus, but
Ouch.
I'll be nice. I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate that, Travis. No, yeah, I'm across social media. If you just type in my name, Mark Hall, in Google, like the phrase Google with my name, typically I show up across. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram as well.
Awesome. I did have a Google Plus account back in the day. I actually liked it. It's too bad it didn't stay. Anyway, Mark, thank you so much for taking this time. This has been a really enlightening conversation, and I'm sure that our audience has learned a lot as well. And I expect that probably there will be folks reaching out, and I trust that you'll point them in the right direction.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you for having me, Travis. It was a great conversation.
Thanks.